What's up, everybody? I'm Thomas J. Bellezza, and welcome to another episode of the Right Mind Set Podcast. So today I have two guests, not one, not three, but two guests, and I would love to bring them to the forefront. Lila, why don't you give yourself a little introduction? Tell the audience who you are.
My name is Lilla Glass. I am a fantasy author, and my debut novel is going to release on July 11th.
Oh, excellent! I love when a book is coming out because it just adds a little bit of excitement to that, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
Mr. Jim, why don't
Yes,
you tell us a
indeed.
little bit about yourself?
Oh, my name is Jim Avelli. I'm also a fantasy author. I do have a book coming up. No idea when it's going to be finished, though. So it's one of those situations.
That's right. We're, as they say, a writer is always in process, never finished.
Yes.
Because even if we finish a book, while we were writing that book, we're already thinking of the next book or a book on this character or that, and
That's it. Yeah. So I guess that's typical. It's not just me then.
Yeah, no, it gets very exhausting because like we don't have enough of us to write several books
right.
at the same time.
Yeah.
Or the famous, this book is going to be a 7-series book, and it's like, well, if it takes you 2 years to write a book, that's a long time.
Yeah. I'm hoping they get quicker as we go on because I'm working on the first one right now. But
yeah,
well,
yeah. I mean, as you discover a process, right, you're going to learn how to kind of get the book out as quick as possible. And
yes.
Layla, is that something you've learned over your writing venture, where each book has progressively gotten not only easier to get out of yourself, but has gotten a little quicker?
So this isn't just my debut book. It's actually the first manuscript I've ever completed. So I hope that's true. I have some drafts done of the second book, and I am almost finished with a book from another series. Both went a little more smoothly. So if that trend continues, I'll be really happy about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, everyone has to start somewhere, but in reality, I would be as confident to say that even though this may be your first quote unquote manuscript, you've been writing your whole life, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, have there been things that you, and even yourself, Jim, but we'll go to Lila first and we'll jump on to Jim. Over the years of just diving into your passion and learning what works for you, is that how you found yourself into the fantasy genre, just through those small works?
For me, most of my writing growing up was actually poetry. So it's definitely where I found my voice. I definitely have a more lyrical style, I think. I've always been a fan of fantasy. I've always read it, and I never really thought that I could write it or be a fantasy author until I got an idea for a story and just kind of rolled with it.
Yeah. You were like, you know what? I got to get this out of my head. It's happening.
Exactly. It took over all my thoughts until I had to spill it out on paper just to clear room in my brain.
Yeah, that's the thing about us writers. We're addicts, and we have to, like, writing gets us. Oh, I feel better. Okay, I took my cocaine.
Yeah. Yeah. Withdrawals and everything.
What about you, Jim? Has the writing process over time before you started working on your first book led you to go, hey, fantasy is definitely where I want to be?
It did, actually. Yeah. Because I started out trying to break into the short story market, which I enjoy them. The problem is that they're not long enough. And so they don't really keep my attention, but that was where the money is. So that's where I wanted to go. But like after a few years of trying at it, it's just found that my heart wasn't in it. And so like I tried some science fiction, tried some other sorts of things here and there, whatever, but always that whole time in the back of my head is all these ideas for fantasy, for like, epic fantasy style things, or the whatever, like constantly kind of like, trying to get my attention. And then so after like years and years of just ignoring it, I was like, all right, fine, I'll write fantasy for the thing. And then so that I feel much more at home now that I made that transition, like back to, I feel like this is where I'm supposed to be. It's a much more comfortable genre. It's what I prefer to read. So it just feels more natural for me to tell stories in that environment.
Is that the same for you, Lila? Have you tried sci-fi, or fantasy has really just been the place you were like, this is where I need to be?
I've done a little bit of other speculative fiction, so sci-fi and horror, but only in short story format. So I really love short stories because they allow me to dip my toes into various pools without having to commit to 500 pages of material. But it's hard for me to imagine doing a full-length novel that isn't fantasy. I'm a whimsical person and I want to create worlds. I guess you can
Now,
do that in sci-fi, but
yeah, it's like, but you could also make like a fantasy sci-fi, which is basically Star Wars, because it's ultimately wizards and but they
Yeah.
they're in space, and it's a western, but it's in space. Like there's a lot of genre touches on it. What is it about fantasy that makes it more of more more enjoyable than say sci-fi? Let's go to Jim first.
Um, well, I can only speak for myself. It's more enjoyable because it feels like there's a bit more freedom, maybe like creatively, like things that like I could pull more ideas out of different places in a fantasy. In sci-fi, I mean, there's no official rule, but it seems like you're expected to like not conform to, but to employ like real science and real physics and real things like the story. And if you could do that and tell a compelling story, like that's great. That's more of a writer than I am, because I can't do that. I need to be able to just like bend and twist things as I need them to tell my story. So that's why fantasy works out well for me.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, I could see that, because like I understand what you're saying. Where sci-fi almost does feel constrained by like it has to have specific technology, and sometimes it has to have technology that doesn't exist, but there needs to be some sense to it. Where
Right.
yeah,
Right.
whereas fantasy, you're like, I have a spell,
Yeah,
and it
pretty
does
much.
whatever I want. Lila, same question. What are your thoughts?
well, I really don't have anything to add to that. I feel like he kind of captured the sentiment in full. I have always been compelled by the unknown, and I love that fantasy doesn't have to have those rules, or even if you know the rules for your fantasy system, you don't necessarily have to tell the reader. And it leaves this element of, like I said before, whimsy. You don't quite have to understand everything, and it adds more magic to it, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Can't go wrong with magic. Well, like in the fantasy world of my novels, I actually have several magical systems. I have like a musical one for the bards. I have like divine for clerics, and then I got magic for the wizards and stuff like that. And they each have their own uh, structure and own rules, and that's always been intriguing to me for fantasy books myself. The thing though is usually when you read a book, sometimes it's just like one thing. It's like, we're gonna make this book about magic, or this book's about dragons, or this book's about what are your thoughts? I'll just throw it to the table, where it's when you're reading a book, do you like when there's a little bit more fullness to the world, or when it's focused solely on like one thing, like Aragon, where it's like he has a connection to dragons?
Hmm.
Lila, you can go.
You're gonna make me choose. Um, I
No,
definitely
you
think
can have both. You can have both.
I love both. I really do. I've really been enjoying Brandon Sanderson's books lately, and those
Oh,
are kind of a huge sprawling world with tons of hard magic systems and real in-world physics that are different for every single planet in the Cosmere, and it's really complicated. But also some of my favorite stories are just simple fairy tales that follow one character discovering something about themselves with one magical element. And so I think I lean more towards the really personal character driven stories, but I do really respect that immersive world building. That
yeah, yeah. Where it's just that, even if it's a little bit of detail, but throughout the book, you're just learning little tidbits, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. How do you feel on that, Jim?
I would agree with the fairy tale kind of vibe of that, because if there's a whole lot of world building going on, I have a hard time paying attention.
Hmm.
Like if the world building and the history and the, like, let's say the physics or the magic system of the world is delivered like within, like let's just say like conversations like among the characters or whatever, that makes more sense to me. It's easier for me to retain. It's easier for me to understand as well, which like that's what a lot of my stuff is, that like smaller scope character driven stuff. Like you follow one character or one group of characters. I prefer not to have like 5 different crews of people running around at the same time doing things like,
Yeah.
but that seems to be the way it has to be done now, thanks to HBO. But like I have, because there's always at least like 2 or 3 characters you don't care about, but it might be important, so let me read it anyway.
Like, I gotta stay in this chapter.
But no, I personally I prefer for reading and for my own work to keep the focus more narrow.
Mm.
And it's just like it's just easier retention of information. Maybe I took a lot of hits to the head as a kid, so maybe that has something to do with it.
Look, you're allowed 12 before you get the free Subway.
Oh, excellent.
I feel the same way. I am a fan though of like if the protagonist is the main character, but they have a group, like it's really from their perspective, and I try not to jump around unless there's a way they can experience it. I don't like. I mean, I do like Game of Thrones, but that like you're reading one chapter and then it's the next chapter is a whole completely different character and they're in a different world. And then the next chapter is a different character. And it takes 6 chapters before we get back to that first character in chapter 1.
Right.
And sometimes that pulls me out. But
right.
I do agree with the world building, and I love it when it's not exposition. I like when it's character driven and it's pulled through a story of discovery, and not necessarily before we go into that cave, you need to understand the process. And there's also a timer on this. We have exactly 22 seconds.
Right.
Yeah. Getting into story, I actually want to throw a question out to the group. I wrote this one down and I was like, this is all right. The majority of a narrative is compiled by its plot and story. If plot is what needs to happen and story is how it unfolds, what is one element to you that you feel pulls these 2 things together the best, and why? And just for fun, we'll pop it up. Go ahead, Lila, you first.
Oh gosh. Let me just process that question and read it again.
Go ahead.
It feels like an SAT question. Like, if the
right? Am I being graded on this? Because
yes.
I'm not prepared for that.
The blue is a bear.
One piece of advice I discovered about writing that completely. Oh, the question on the board is different from the one you asked.
Yeah, I summarized.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wait. I apologize. That is a different question. That's the end question. I may have given away something, and I apologize for that. Oh, it doesn't even fit. The question doesn't even fit into the thing. All right, I'll just read it again. I'll read it.
Trim, edit.
All right. So basically, if plot and story make up narrative, okay, what is another element that really pulls those 2 things together, and why?
I want to say voice.
Okay.
That's really rough, and I am honestly fairly new to this field compared to a lot of authors out there, so I could be entirely off base. But
no one is wrong on their experience within the industry, and that's what this shows. What the beauty of this show, just so you know, before you finish your answer, is that I want the world to see that we all experience the writing process different, and there is no right and wrong. There are rules to writing, but they're there to be broken. And I want to show that there's different ways to look at the process. So with that said, if you believe it's voice, go on, let it out.
Okay. Very simply, just kind of the style of story that you are deciding to tell does have an impact on at least how you present what's happening and how you tie what's happening in the big picture in with what's happening on a character level. For instance, with my series, it does build outward into a bigger world, but I start very narrow with just a couple characters and a couple point of views and very personal stories before branching out into the bigger narrative, because I wanted to have the vibes of a Victorian fairy tale. It's written in a very kind of distant, whimsical, lyrical prose, and I don't think that a ton of exposition would have fit into that. Does that make any sense?
100%. Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Yeah.
Hmm.
Voice is definitely something that sets each writer apart because it's how we write, it's how we use chapters, it's if we use long chapters, short chapters, it's the dialogue, it's, as you say, basically purple proing it up. You need some fancy lyrical prose. I like that you said that because Jim and I are both musicians, so whenever there's a
Sure.
melodic movement to the narration or even dialogue, it's
That's what I like to read as well. There's like that sort of like a little, not like like massive long, like an entire paragraph is a page, that kind of thing. But if like a little wordier, a little more description, a little more like a longer kind of a flow to get the idea out, rather than like, I know like industry standard is to chop everything down as short as possible and use as few words as possible. It's like, well, yeah, okay, there's logic to that. It makes sense, It's like, but sometimes things do need to be delivered in a longer, more roundabout way. Like I feel like there are places where it fits.
Yeah.
Not everything needs to be slashed and burned.
Right, and there's an actual rhythm to a lot of it. It's interesting. I definitely have never been a good musician. I'd say I was a wannabe musician long before I was a writer as well. And so it's interesting that we all have musical backgrounds and then like appreciate lyricism a little more, probably because of that.
Yeah. The rhythm and the timing of the words in a sentence or whatever, we all probably get that, whereas like other writers don't. Is it not to say one's better than the other, but it makes more sense to me.
Well, yeah, it's like, if we grew up in a certain period of time where painting was a very specific way, but then we started exploring, we liked more reds. Some people are like, no, in this time period, it's all about greens. And we're like, yeah, but we're finding something to do with reds, and I think it really does come down to, just our preferences and stuff like that. And
Right.
yeah, but
And
I do. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
And you find, like, for whatever your style is, you'll find your audience. If you do what you're doing long enough, you'll find your crowd.
Yeah.
Whoever that is, especially now with all of the publishing options that are out there. It's much. I mean, like, yeah, the old guard, like, they complain about how people could just self-publish whatever they want and put all this. It's like, well, yeah, that's good for me because, like, in the industry gatekeepers in New York City have seen my stuff and they ain't interested. And so I just now I have options, which is nice.
Did they respond with, I noticed your book as they skim through it has nothing to do with Brandon Sanderson. You think we could maybe just take his book and just...
Well, I was also pitching around the time when angsty young people with magical powers and vampire boyfriends was like the thing to write, and I generally don't do that. I mean, it's cool, but it's not my thing.
You're not into 300-year-old men going after 12-year-old girls in high school? Jim, come on. It's love. It's forbidden romance.
In Europe, it's not so forbidden.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. Are you telling me you wrote more than one page of this? Yeah, well, think about it. It's vampires. It's so exciting. No, she's 12. It's vampires. And then she has a child. I don't even want to get into it. I don't want to get into it. I watched those movies just to be like, I need to see what the hype is about. And I was just like, oh, okay.
It is a compelling concept to be, or whatever. You have like the one character that like is driven to like eat and kill the other character or whatever, but will not for such and such a reason. Maybe because it's a romantic relationship, or they're have an alliance for some reason or another. So that is, there is meat to that. It's nice, but when that's the focus of the story, it just I have a hard time paying attention. I'm like, what else you got besides this like doomed romance? Like it's cool, but I need more than that.
Yeah, and it's easy to just make her 18, 19, 20, 21, and then you go, well, he's over 100 years old, so like now we're in that territory of he's never going to find someone who's 300 years old. So, but like in their 20s, 30s, now we're talking like now I could follow, but once I'm like why is he in high school?
Well, you were just talking about target audiences, right? You're finding your audience. And I think the audience
That's,
for that
that's true.
particular
Yeah.
series is high school girls. So.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, yes, yeah. High school, they're like, I hope a vampire, but like, why is he there? Like, I can understand. She's like, vampire walks into the room. I smelled you because he smells her or something, right? She has like that. So it's like, I smelled you, and I need to eat you, and then he just fell in love at first sight. Like, okay, now we're working in somewhere, but he goes to school. That's his cover.
I know, yeah, they're trying to maintain the cover, and so they go to school over and over again, but like they don't actually need to. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, no
they
one's
could
gonna be
just
like, you're going to jail for not having your child go to school. It's the truancy laws. Well, we're gonna move then. Like,
yeah, right.
but yeah, your market and I love what you said, Jim, with the you write what's basically what you want to write, your passion, and your audience will find you. They'll discover the things that they appreciate. That's why Stephen King has an audience. There are certain people that are like, I need a Stephen King book, and there's other people that are just like, that is not going to do it for me. I have no interest in
Right,
horror, and
right,
that's their
right.
choice, right? So, but to ask you the same question as I did, Lila,
I forgot
Jim,
it already.
I'm gonna give it back to you. I'm gonna give it back to you. Uh, so plot and story are two different elements in a story. Plot is what needs to happen. Story is how it unfolds.
Mm.
But in your opinion, what is one other element that you feel would pull these two things together to make a better story, and why?
I would say, I would say environment, like the story, like the setting of the story, the world can itself can be used as like a way to bring elements of the story to get to tell more of the story. Let's say for I've read a lot of well his real name was Edward Plunkett, but Lord Dunsany was and he'll sometimes it's a little digressive. Like some people like it'll put some people to sleep or whatever, but like he'll tell a little bit of the history of a place based on like let's say an object, like say like a fence post with
Yeah.
like some like old like sword slashes on it. He'll tell you a little bit about how that happened before moving on, but just like not to go on and on about it, but like to you can add things to like the environment itself can be used as a storytelling device as
Yeah,
it, it also helps out with like if there's action, if there's dialogue, but then also like history and some of the world building as well can be done that way.
yeah, and an environment really does help with destroying the white room syndrome.
Mhm.
Like you don't want people just walking around in the ether because we don't know where they
Oh,
are. We don't know how the room smells. We don't know, how it feels around
right,
them,
right, right.
and so
That's
that's a really great answer, Jim, because like the environment is a character in the story.
right.
And when you take that out, the characters are sort of floating around in this white, just
Yeah, yeah. And which is, but it's also easy to forget about because like it's like especially I get focused on the characters and what they're doing, and I forget like wait, where are they again? Oh shit! And like they, I forget to move them from place to place. I'm like, oh, they're still at the bar. God damn! And now I got to go back and
well,
but
it's twofers on Thursdays.
yeah, right. I hear Steppenwolf's playing, so
Lila, have you ever found yourself during the process of writing your first manuscript, running into the white room syndrome and like forgetting the environment occasionally?
I don't think that's one of my weaknesses. I have a great many weaknesses, but I might do the opposite. I'm really into descriptive depth, and sometimes I'll be like, 2 pages later, I'm still describing the garden. Maybe I should edit this down a little bit.
Well, listen, everyone loves Anne Rice and Faulkner. They made a name for themselves for their length of descriptions, and there's nothing wrong with taking a moment and just pulling the reader into that room and then letting those characters kind of have their discovery and their conflicts and their resolutions. So I think that's a powerful way to write too. There's nothing wrong with it. You do what you do.
and then the question becomes, at least for me anyway, though, like how often do I do that before I start to lose people's attention?
Hmm.
Like if I am I going to do that with every room that this character goes into, or just the important ones, or like that's something that I struggle with. Like how much is too much?
Yeah. Yeah, one of what I try to do personally, or like when I talk to, like, if I'm working with a client, I go, how does this piece elevate the story, or how does the story influence the interest? And for that sword moment on the wood that you were talking, the pole, the way I would approach it is, if it evokes a memory, or if it creates a conversation between the characters, or, like, maybe he sees it, touches it. Well, if he's touching it, now I'm allowed to explain it because it's influencing choice. The character made a choice, and therefore we're reacting to that choice. And then another character might surprise them and be like, oh yes, my daughter's been chopping away at it, she's always wanted to learn the sword. and
Right,
and
right.
now you're using the environment to create reaction to choices.
Mm.
I like that. I have read books though where someone's like walking through a forest, and then out of nowhere they're just like, by the way, and no one's saying it. The narrator's going, this
Right,
forest has been haunted since 1907, and the
right,
ghost, but like the ghost never comes into the story. It doesn't create conflict. It's just the writer was
right,
like, what's so cool? The story about this forest, but I don't want to tell that story, but I need people to know about that story as they walk. We're in the forest. It's
right,
prompting the
right.
interest for, and you're like, no, it doesn't do anything for the story, you know? Uh,
Yeah. When it
yep.
does, when it just pops in, or if you have the Gandalf character that just like knows everything about everything and won't shut up.
I wish I had my little bubble pipe like you have and just be like, remember the fireworks. They were created by the dwarves. Always follow your nose. Okay.
I needed to show how serious I am about being an author.
I love that photo, by the way. He has a photo, Lila, on his author page where he's like blowing on this little green pipe, and his little bubbles coming out.
That's wonderful.
So good. All right. So I'm not sure if you've listened to the show, the episodes or anything, but one of the things we really like to dive into to, again, show other writers, especially starting out or have been doing it for a while, that there is so many processes,
Process,
processes,
I.
process, rhinoceri or rhino. Okay. There's a bunch of them to everything that we do as writers. And when we find what clicks for us, it really helps us get into that world. So with that said, I kind of want to explore your writing, the way you write, and let's take it step by step. We're going to start with Lila, and we'll jump to Jim. Lila, how do you begin the concept for a story before you write word one?
Usually it starts with a question for me. My first series basically spawned from the question, I wonder what sort of weird things a burglar in a fantasy world would witness. And that grew into a 4-book series. So I would just definitely say that I ask myself a question and let my mind wander for a bit.
Oh, nice. So your first, so it's from the question to basically you brainstorm on that and kind of explore where it would go. Oh, I love that. That's really good. Jim, what is your process before you write word one?
Mm. I usually start with the ending. Actually, I start from the ending and work back, like just as an idea, like a scene that kind of like plays out. Like I kind of watch it in my head and see, and then and if it's interesting enough to keep my attention for a while, then I start to ask, okay, well, like how did we get here, and like who are these people? What are they doing? And then that's kind of how the whole thing started. Really, was like the ending of the first book. This thing happens, and then that idea just kind of popped in my head. I think it was I was having a conversation with somebody, and I got the idea, whatever. But then I started to ask the questions, like Lila said, like questions about how do we get here, who are these people, what are they trying to accomplish, and then that kind of forces it to like to kind of grow and spread in different directions. And then I try to just just go with like what I need for the storage, kind of like somebody once told me that I think they were like a set designer or like a carpenter that worked on sets or whatever. Like we only build what the camera needs to see. Everything else is kind of like lost time or whatever. So that's kind of how I started to approach it at that point. I was like, I'm only going to build what I need to show with the story. The rest of it can wait. And so, but yeah, usually I start from the end and work back.
That's an interesting way to approach it too, because now you get to play with all the causality of choices that would technically lead to that final moment. And you're still free to explore so many different choices, even though the end might be like, this has to happen.
Right.
You're still leaving yourself open to kind of jump all over the place.
Sure. And I mean, then there's lots of editing and like redrafting it because the first way doesn't work out or whatever. But yeah, that's usually how
wait, edit? No. Once you write the first draft, because we wrote it, it's perfect how it is.
It flows finished from my brain hole.
From my brain hole. All right. Well, moving on from the beginning of it, what is the next step for you to take in Lilla's situation? You take that question, you kind of brainstorm on that question. And once you kind of like articulate those thoughts, what is the next step for you to take?
I come up with, well, the opposite. I start with the first line, and I sometimes take forever on that first line because it's really important and sets the whole tone for the book. It just flows out from there. I'm a pantser, so I do a zero draft and I let the characters make organic choices, and I tend to write really impulsive characters that make outlining impossible until I've got a draft down. So just write it out and see where it goes.
Do you do the Stephen King thing where he says, I write until I realize I've been writing far too much. I need to throw a monster in the room?
Possibly.
Because he does that too. He's a pantser, but he'll discover it. Who was Quentin Tarantino? Somebody who he's like, I know what I want the ending to be based like Kill Bill. Bill needs to die, but I'll only outline the first act. Then I'll take that first act to influence the choices in the second act, leading to the midpoint. So the ascending rise to the midpoint conflict. And he goes, and then once I hit the midpoint conflict, how that plays out, I have no idea because I allow the characters to decide. And when I finish that, I throw it all out because now I know the characters. And then I start over with a loose idea of what I had written. And then I allow it to kind of like conclude to the ending. So I always thought that was interesting. As a pantser, I'm not a pantser, but as he's a pantser. And he goes through discovery. I always thought that was interesting.
What is this pantser you speak of?
So a pantser is just someone who writes off the cuff of their pants. You know, they don't have any no outlines. They're just like, here's an idea, and they just keep writing and throwing stuff on the page.
Okay.
Yeah. I like what you said about Tarantino. I think that my method is kind of similar. I view it as more as like a really foggy landscape, and I can see maybe 3 landmarks, and I just forge through until I get to them. Doesn't matter how.
Yeah. And then it's like, oh, I like where I went, but I really know these people. I think I can make more sense of their choices leading to that. And the opposite of pantser, Jim, is a gardener.
Oh.
Right. So you have the gardener and the pantser, and then you have the architect and the architect, gardener. Architect is an outliner. Gardener is the pantser. Right. And then a pantser and an outliner. That was confusing. I apologize for that.
Soldier, sailor, pantser, spy.
I usually say pantser or plotter because alliteration helps me remember.
Oh, all right. There you go. Pantser and plotter. There you go. See, you simplify. Thank you for that. And that's what I needed.
That helps a lot.
Yeah. Jim knows my brain just goes, I can't keep up with it sometimes, and I just ramble. Jim, your turn. So you said you start with the ending, and then you kind of like brainstorm on what could you linger on it, and you let it gestate because that's sexy. And then from there, what's your next step with your story development?
From there, usually I get myself a notebook, just like a regular marble notebook. Usually I need a fresh one when I have a new idea for some kind of a story. Sometimes I'll use half of it, sometimes less, whatever. But then I'll once I have the ending in mind and I have my notebook, then I'm free to just do whatever needs to be done. Like I can make notes, like in the margins, and I can cross things out, and I can scribble, and there's no like I try to avoid the keyboard until like I'm definitely know what I'm doing, and then I just decide what in a way, actually kind of like Lila said, the foggy landscape. I figure out what those landmarks are, what those peaks are that are sticking up like out of the fog, and it's like, oh, that's this moment, and that's this other thing, and then I little by little I figure out how to put them together, how to get like characters from one to the next, or how many I need is another thing. Sometimes I end up with more than I need, and I cut a few of them because I just did that with the book I'm working on now. I had a lot more like plot points than I needed to get from A to B. So like it's like no, these 5 or 6 things actually don't need to happen because we could just go around and go this way, and so that's what I end up doing in my notebook of scribbles.
Now, since you both mentioned this before we go a little further into it, so you have like the hazed environment where you're like, oh, I want to hit these spots and stuff. Have you ever gotten to a point where you like had this just love for this one idea, this one landmark of opportunity, and you realized that it was going to destroy the story or just wasn't working, and you have to find yourself taking it out, but it's something you just love? Have you found yourself doing that, Lila?
Not. I've had. It's hard not to give spoilers.
You don't have to say what it is, but like ultimately something. I had this thing, and blah, 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 blah.
I can say I definitely had wanted things to turn out differently for some characters than they were able to, and that's about as far as I can go. There was no logical way to make everything end up the way that I wanted to at some points.
What you bring up a great point. Like it's like with characters too, and where you're like, this character would be great if these things happen, and then you realize as you're writing that character, their voice and their motivations and their choices have nothing to do with what you're interested in, and you have to change this poor character, and you're like, that's going to actually change this because this character was created for that thing, and now they're this character, and you just love it. So you're like, you gotta, where's it gonna go? Now, Jim, you said you will take a part out. You said that you've taken a few parts out, but what about parts, like I said, Delilah, that you're just like, this is the reason I'm even writing the book. It's because of this landmark. It's Leonard Skinner. I need him in the story. How do you work through that to just be like, I got to get rid of it?
Well, I mean, it's never easy. It's gotten easier as time goes on. The more I do it, but it's never easy, to get rid of something that I, let's say I have a personal attachment to, like this thing that happens or this character. But as the drafts progress and the story changes, because ultimately it does, the more I look over it, like the story changes, the characters change as well. Then if that thing doesn't serve a purpose anymore, either I can repurpose it, maybe like just write it up in its own little file and put it in my folder and maybe use it some other time, some other place in another story, or just scrap it altogether, which I prefer not to do, but sometimes it happens. Sometimes, and you mentioned characters before not doing as they're told. That does happen at times. I'll have a character go into a situation and think like, well, like she knows much better than that. She wouldn't go into this ambush because like, this, that, and the other thing. And like, then you sometimes like write characters that are too well prepared for the things you throw them into. And you're like, that wouldn't no, that wouldn't work. And so I've run into that problem as well. That the characters figure things out before I do.
Yeah, I mean, and that's when you really developed a good character, because there's a living person. Not that it's like you're going through psychosis.
What's wrong with that?
Don't take away my psychosis. but like the character's so well defined. you know when you're doing wrong by that character on the page.
Right. Right.
I have a like a writing buddy where like we kind of like help each other with their books and stuff. It's like friend on friend. And one of the things that keeps coming up with her is I have a character as the protagonist, whatever, and he's supposed to just be the hero. You know, he's like he's a good guy. He's pure. His biggest struggle is his inner conflict. Like he doesn't really like killing, and like, but he has to. And then he's trying to like, am I going to go to hell? Like, is this making me everything that I'm fighting against? And that's like an inner. And her argument is, you have to make the conflicts more physical. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, he should be fighting this darkness and like, you know, he should be, getting beaten up more. And like, but I'm like, that's not his story. He's not a great, morally gray character. He's so heroic that his soul is being judged by himself in his acts to defend people or protect people. What do you run into as writers when you come into, like, if you have a critique partner and they come in and they're fundamentally telling you to do things that has almost nothing to do with the character's moral stances? How do you approach that especially when, you're working together? Lila, you first.
I don't think that I've had quite that experience. I've had a similar experience with my first critique partner, who's honestly amazing, and I still send them, my second draft to beta read because they are really helpful and they have a very different perspective than me. But they learned to write in a very, very modern style. So they were constantly telling me things like, zoom in more on the character, take out all of these instances of the word was. And I just listened to their advice pretty blindly the first time through. And it really ended up ruining the tone of my manuscript. So I had to know what my voice was and kind of learn what I was going for and where it differed from what they liked to read. And now I know when to take their advice to heart because they've really found something that I completely overlooked, and when to think, well, that would work in a more modern, like urban fantasy, but I'm going for a fairy tale, so I need to keep that was right where it is.
Yeah, that comes up, especially with those fantasy novels, because like we're all fantasy writers, and like we also do like flowery writing as well, and not purple prose per se, but flowery writing. And the critique partner usually is like, why don't you just say what it is? And I was like, well, there's subtext, there's choice, there's motivation, there's deception, there's manipulate, there's all these things that are going on, and they're not going to be like, I don't like this, it's bad.
Right. Yeah.
That's not interesting. But her way of writing is she's so direct that you're not discovering character. You're just being told, I am upset at you, and not necessarily like, yeah, of course, we'll do it your way if that's what you want. And you're like, oh, that character feels like they might not want to do it. Because there's a little bit of tension in there. But back to the question at hand. Oh, it's a puppy. All right. I have a little puppy. We don't stop for dogs on this show. All right. But Jim, same question as I asked Lila. Which I believe I am forgetting. Lila, do you remember the question? It was
if your critique partner disagrees with something fundamental to your story, how do you respond?
Thank you so much for that.
That for me, I've only had that experience once when it was something really like serious to the story. That was a beta reader. And I tend to use pretty few of them because I found if you have a large group of beta readers, you get a lot of the same answers from them. So I shrunk the group down to just a few people. But this one particular reader pointed out that like this, like there was a romantic relationship like that kind of like progressing through the story between these two characters, and then like they pointed out that like no, like it just seems forced. It seems like it's rushed. It doesn't really make sense. And I'm like, yeah, it's like, but it needs to be there because of the next book or whatever. And it's but it didn't feel natural or for whatever. But then I'm thinking like, is it really necessary, or am I just putting it in there because that's what I'm used to seeing? in
Mm.
like other books and in movies or whatever. Like this romance is always is like shoehorned into the story, like to I guess to sell more tickets or to sell more books or whatever. And then that's the realization that I came to was I'm just so accustomed to seeing it that I think it needs to be there. And so I try to shove it in because it's supposed to be like, but and so in the end I just like they're those two characters like they just work together and they're friends and that's it.
Yeah.
And so like and then I thought, oh, you know what? There's actually nothing wrong with that because that's kind of how it is in real life. You don't end up like falling in love with everybody you meet at work. That would be awful. You know?
That's why you and I never dated.
Yeah, right, exactly. Not since I lost my hair anyway.
Well, you know, mine's just my back hair. I just pull it up, and all right.
Yeah, that was my experience with the beta reader that pointed out something, big.
Yeah, and I really like that idea that you're talking about. Like they're just friends because you're right. Like a lot of times you read a story and there just seems to always be some sort of romantic tension, or it just turns into something. Um, I like if it becomes a natural thing. Like again, if you learn your characters and the characters kind of progress to it, that is so much different than how do I work a love angle? Like
Right.
what is the love story that I put in here? And again, we're all, even though I'm a huge outliner, part of my process is discovery through my zero draft outlining process. But like you said, we're discovering the story and the characters, and there's going to come a point where we're like, we just want them to be friends, and then you're like, I feel it. I feel there's something there. I feel like, and it's like, and then you go, but I don't want that, and then you start fighting it, and you realize it's actually taking away from their story because now it's being thrown in there, the they can't be together energy, and you're like, oh, maybe I should go back and but that's all part of the discovery. Okay, so continuing the method of madness. So Lila, you said it's you come up with a question, you brainstorm that question, then you start discovering, you lead to a certain point. You somewhat like Quentin Tarantino, but his is more script oriented, yours is novel. How do you we'll jump a few steps. How do you find yourself ready to end the first draft? And what I mean is like you finish and you go, this is my first draft. Let's move on to the next step. How do you determine if you've actually finished your first draft?
Somewhere in the final third of the book, I will just realize how it is inevitably going to end. And so once I write that out, it's done. I know that's not a very technical answer, but I like to think that I write by feel the way some people play by ear.
Okay, I like that. All right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's a good. There are no wrong answers. Jim, same question. How do you know when you're like, this is my first draft? It's done. Next step.
Well, I have the advantage of starting from the end. So when I come full circle and I return to that point that I started from in the when I come up with the ending and I work backwards or whatever, then I know I'm getting close to when I'll be satisfied with it. But when I feel like all of the serious matters have been answered and it just feels like settled, then I know like the first draft is done. And then I take some time off and I go back to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the advantage of starting from the end for me.
Yeah, it's sort of like I'm reaching the pole, the mile marker I have gotten here. If I go past it, but it's the same thing. Like we used to, we're musicians, so like sometimes like how long can we work on this song?
Yeah, yeah, right.
We're like, the song is done.
Yeah, right.
let's go.
Unless you have something specific you're working on, like we need to tighten up this change from this to this.
Yeah.
And then once that's done, but if you're just working apart, then it does get to the point where like we're just, who was that? Liquid Tension. It was Tony Levin. Was it because he was playing with Portnoy and all those other like prog rock guys? And then he's like, no, it's like, this is my 5-minute rule. We're going to spend no more than 5 minutes on this part. And if we can't get it, we can't get it. And the rest of them, because the rest of them are used to playing like 15-minute tracks and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's a good rule, though. It's like we're spending time, guys. We're spending time.
Right.
But yeah, like with a book, there's definitely has to be a certain point where we have to take accountability and just put the brakes on and go, look, it's the first draft. It's not going to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. I gave it one read through at the end. What feels like it needs to be there is there. The plots are there. Characters make sense. All right, next step. And I do the same as Jim. I'll take a break. I'll walk away from the book for like 2 weeks to a month just to get myself not stuck in that, like, I know everything about this world,
Right.
all right. And then the final step is ultimately, after you do your, you have your second draft, you have your alpha readers, your beta readers, you got all this stuff going on. When do you feel the book is ready to be sent out and published, Lila?
Well, I queried my first novel, so it did get picked up by a publisher. So I get the wonderful benefit of them deciding that for me.
Excellent. Good.
Well, I guess my question to adjust that is, when did you feel the book was ready to send to your publisher and go, look, this is the book I believe is ready to be published?
That's a bit of a longer answer, because my first initial answer is I figured that way too soon. Before I had any beta readers or anyone look at it, I went into this completely blind, knew nothing about the industry. So yeah, once I got a ton of rejections back, I realized I needed to work on it a little bit more, put it through some beta readers. And I guess once I got through about 5 beta readers, that's when I'm like, okay, this is probably pretty good. They seem to not have any major issues with it at this point. I can try again. And that went much better. The rejections were much nicer that time around.
And what do you feel out of all their suggestions and all the things that they felt were not working, what was the biggest one that you feel definitely helped the book by changing or cleaning up?
Really knowing my audience, I was not sure whether what I was writing was YA or adult. It's adult.
Oh,
It
yeah.
very much is. But there's so much crossover right now that I tried to do the George R.R. Martin thing where I gave them all realistic ages. They should not have been 17. I upped all their ages. So it's now an NA book, so new adult, and that worked much better. I knew how to target it and query it a lot better.
Excellent. And for anyone listening to the audio or watching, thank you, by the way. To determine where the book kind of goes, usually you take the protagonist and what their general age is how you follow them. So if they're in the teenage ages, it would be young adult, like was it 16 to 18, and then anything older than that becomes new. So basically your protagonist defines the starting point of where this book is playing. However, the way you write also will determine that. So if it's a little bit more aggressive or or it has as R.R. Martin does, he goes, I know this scene is about the mother and losing their children, but can she be naked? Doesn't add to the story, but she's vulnerable. oh, your R.R. whatever, we'll do it. Then it's not new adult, it's porn. Okay, so Jim, where is your when do you when do you feel your book is like, all right, this book is ready to be published or handed to a publisher?
But I've only gotten to that point once, but when I did, I felt like it was like I was comfortable with it, because I like with, I'm sure, a lot of other writers, like I'm my own critic most of the time, and then like the beta readers will point out things. A lot of times they point out things that I don't see because you don't really pick up your own. It's like doing, it's like proofreading. Like you're not going to pick out your own errors. But when I feel comfortable, at least with where everything is and what happens and all of the characters and the way everything's settled into place, then I feel like it's ready. Because then at that point, if there's anything that they want to nitpick on, I'm sure they will let you know.
Yeah, and also, with your alpha or beta readers, especially your beta readers, it's the rule of majority. Like if one person is like, I don't like this character and their portrayal, and everyone else is like, that's my favorite character. Like,
Right.
have a nice
Right.
day.
Right.
But same question to you, because you had some good feedback that helped you clean up your book. What was the biggest thing you got from the beta readers where you like, this change, it really made this book tight?
For me?
Yeah, for you. Yeah.
Oh, that was. I think it would have been that same example that I've said, that I brought up before, was the relationship between the two characters that I was trying to force in there that didn't work. It tightened up a lot of the dialogue because I didn't have to keep like giving them reasons to talk to each other alone. There's like, okay, so there's and it was a sci-fi setting, so I'm like, the power thing is out here and only she knows how to fix it, and then the guy's there because that's where the soda machine is, so yeah, there you go. And just coming up with all of these scenarios, but like, and then like when that finally sank in that it wasn't working, and I was willing to like that was the example of like the baboon trap where they cut the hole in the tree and they put the things in, and the baboon can't get its hand out because it's been like, I was finally ready to let go of the peaches or whatever.
Yeah.
And so like then that that tightened up the whole thing because I could eliminate all of that extra stuff that I was forcing in there and sort of artificially inflating, and just get back to the story. Like the things that happen, the things that need to happen.
You eradicated the subplot. You were like,
in a way, yes, it needed to go. It needed to go. It wasn't doing well.
Yeah.
It was coughing up blood the night before. So.
All right. So we're getting close to the end of the show, and I'm going to ask my end of the show question. It's different for each season. We're going to start with Lila, which is this question. What is one piece of advice you discovered about writing, either through someone else or yourself, that completely changed the way you approach the writing process?
Just a small question.
Yeah.
Probably just that it is different for everybody. I know people who write every day for 4 hours a day. I know people who write on weekends. I know people who write by the plot. I know people who completely write off the cuff, and all of them end up with pretty good stories in the end. All of those methods are completely valid, so that you don't have to do exactly what everybody else is doing to get a good story in the end.
Excellent. That's some great advice. I appreciate you for that answer. It fits the motif of our show too. Jim, your turn. What is one piece of advice you discovered about writing, either through someone else or yourself, that completely changed the way you approach the writing process?
I would say it's not a piece of advice that was like given to me, like someone told me, but something I observed about just like, and it's back to my my musical background, something I observed about punk bands in particular, and like Long Island hardcore shows and like that sort of a thing or whatever. And that is like, I just to get on stage and to do your thing, whatever that is. And if people don't like it, they don't have to buy a ticket, so long as you're satisfied with it in a way. And I translated that into writing, like that. It felt like the light went on in my head. It was like, so I don't really need to alter my alter my approach, because that's what like the publishers want. Like, you will find, if you make enough noise, you'll find your people. And that's kind of like that changed everything for me, because I was, so I can just do it my way, because there really is no, there's no wrong answer.
That's and that's a beautiful way, especially for new writers out there. If you're worrying about, taking that next step, and, is your book good or bad, you shouldn't be writing for an audience or other people. You got to write for yourself first. And when your voice, when your style resonates with people, it's definitely going to touch them in a way that makes them want to support you and buy your book. And both of you gave some really great advice, I think, for listeners, newbies, and people really jumping into the process. So before we end the show, Lilla Glass, how can people find you if they want to check you out?
You can definitely find me on TikTok. I'm on there pretty frequently. And my website, lillaglass.com, pretty easy to remember because my name is actually fairly unique. So find me there. I have a newsletter that you get a free short story when you sign up. I won't spam you, I promise.
And that's Lilla
GLAS.
Glass. It's for anyone listening to the audio on Spotify. But her information will be in the description of the video as well. So check that out. Jim, how do they find you?
I also have one of those websites with my name, jimavelli.com. And I'm also on Instagram. I'm working on, getting more of a presence out there. And so I'm going to try to come up with some new content, and I'm going to try to get a mailing list together and all of things that I've had at one time and then just kind of abandoned, and I'll try to get it up and running again. But the website is still there.
You're going to have to get the Oompa Loompas to start working.
I wish I had some of them. That would be great.
And anyone listening on the radio, Jim's name is Jim and his last name's Avelli. And again, his information will be in the description below. So right off the bat, thank you so much for you both coming on the show. I had a blast. I really enjoyed you being here.
That was a good
Thank
time.
you so
I
much
appreciate it.
thanks for inviting me. It was nice to meet you both.
Absolutely. And as they always say, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I love you guys for being here and giving me your time. And to the audience out there, the whole process about writing, because final thoughts is you're a writer for you first. It's your passion. It's something that comes from you. So remember that when you're deciding to put pen to page, or in some cases, fingers to the keyboard, and you got to keep developing the right mindset. I'll see you next time. Have a great day. Bye.